Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from RAU'S.
Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of UPSC examination. Today we have taken up Delhi edition of The Hindu newspaper dated 29th of December 2020. The articles which we are going to cover today are displayed on the screen. Let us now begin the discussion. But before we jump into the discussion, let us have a look at few of the statements which you have to find yourself whether they are true or false. Naxalbari became famous for being the site of a left-wing poor peasants uprising in 1967, which began with the land to tiller slogan, an uprising continuing to this day. In the Article 244(1) of the Constitution, expression scheduled areas means such areas as the President may by order declare to be scheduled areas. Civic Action Program scheme is being run by Ministry of Rural Development. Cognizable offence means an offence for which a police officer may arrest without warrant in accordance with the first schedule of CRPC or under any other law. Bail is a rule, jail is an exception is a legal doctrine that was laid down by the Supreme Court of India in a landmark judgment of State of Rajasthan versus Balchand Balia. The Indo-Pacific is a political economic vision, while the Quad is a military strategic vision. India and China both are the members of the Quad. So the first news which we have taken for discussion today appears on page number 4. CDS lauds Odisha Police for tackling LWE challenges. Force is pioneer of security, says General Rawat. Since the Odisha Police have earned very high standards of law and order in the state and have succeeded in tackling the challenges of left-wing extremism with good results, it is important for us to discuss this, one of the most important internal security issues. Now, if you have a look at GS3 syllabus, under it, there is a line which says linkages between development and spread of extremism. Now, the matters related to law and order and internal security are looked after by Ministry of Home Affairs, and it publishes an annual report every year. And this is a screenshot from the 2019, which is the latest report of MHA. And let us just look at the first paragraph of the report. It says, internal security issues in the country can broadly be categorized as follows: terrorism in the hinterland of the country, left-wing extremism in certain areas, security situation in Jammu and Kashmir, and insurgency in the northeastern states. So when UPSC expects you to be aware about the internal security challenges, these are the 4 internal security challenges which you should prepare for the mains examination. And of course, left-wing extremism appears prominently over there. UPSC has asked questions both in 2015 as well as in 2018. In 2015, UPSC had asked, the persisting drives of the government for development of large industries in backward areas have resulted in isolating the tribal population and the farmers who face multiple displacements with Malkangiri and Naxalbari foci. Discuss the corrective strategies needed to win the left-wing extremism doctrine affected citizens back into the mainstream of social and economic growth. In 2018, UPSC asked, left-wing extremism is showing a downward trend, but still affects many parts of the country. Briefly explain the Government of India's approach to counter the challenges posed by LWE. And so keeping in mind these past year question paper as well as the syllabus, we are going to first understand what Naxalism actually is, what is its ideology, how due to the government deficit, due to various issues related to the constitutional and legal measures, it spread in so many states and districts in our country. And finally, since last 10 years, we are seeing a decline or a downfall in left-wing extremism threat. And so what government has done right in order to achieve this reduction in Naxalite activity in the central regions of our country. So let us now begin the discussion, starting with understanding what Naxalism actually is. So Naxalism is a far left violent movement which aims to overthrow the government of India through people's war. So it basically wants to replace the Indian state through a violent and a guerrilla movement. According to the recent MHA release, it is currently impacting more than 80 districts scattered around 11 states in our country. So you can easily understand how widespread the spread of Naxalism is, although it has decreased through time, but it is still prevalent in many areas.
If we talk about Naxalism, from where does this word comes from? It comes from a village known by the name of Naxalbari in Darjeeling district of West Bengal. Because this whole movement is derived from there. Because in 1967, peasant revolt against landlords in Naxalbari village in Darjeeling district of West Bengal went out of control and police opened fire on them. And there began this violent movement, which actually claims to base its ideology on three important people. First is Marx and Engels, and the second is Mao Zedong. Now, if we talk about left or far left movement, most of them derive their ideology from the same set of people, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. So what was their actual ideology? So according to them, all social relations and state structures in an elitist or a capitalist society are quite exploitative in nature. And since they are exploitative in nature, they need to be replaced. And so according to Naxals, the current Indian state is based on similar capitalistic or semi-feudal setup. And so it needs to be replaced. But there are various ways of replacing a government or a state, but they talk about a revolution. Only a revolution can change this exploitative setup. And so whoever bases his or her ideology on Marx believes that only a revolutionary change through active means can end this. And that means is provided by Mao Zedong, who led the revolution of Communist Party in China, because he gave the concept of guerrilla warfare, protracted people's war, a war led by the common people against the state, the war not in democratic sense, but war which is violent in nature, which includes surrounding the cities from countryside, political transformation through mass involvement, and finally, through these measures, overthrow the state. And so Naxalites base their ideology on these two things. And so whenever you read news articles related to some Naxalite activity, they basically deal with attack on prominent political leaders, paramilitary forces and police personnel because they want to overthrow the Indian state. But what is the reality of Naxalites? If you look at their overall activity, it seems to be that they are working against the interests of the people they claim to defend. They want to perpetuate their power in jungles through fear psychosis. They attack civilians and personnel from CAPF or Central Armed Police Forces. They carry out regular extortions, not just from the local people but also from industrialists. So although they claim to base their ideology on Marx and against capitalism, but they let the industries thrive as long as they agree to pay protection or extortion money. And so the question arises that under the constitutional and legal framework of India, which is considered to be one of the most democratic setup, how come an ideology like Naxalite not only emerged but spread into such a vast territory in our country, as you can see on the diagram in front of your screen? At its peak, it impacted so many districts and states in our country. An answer to that lies in government deficit, the inability or inefficiency of the government to cater to the needs and demands of the people, especially the tribal people, created a fertile ground for this kind of ideology, which ultimately engulfed a major region in our central parts of country. And let us understand those reasons one by one. But basically they can be categorized into four main reasons. Starting with lack of proper land reforms, lack of proper implementation of the provisions provided in the 5th schedule of our constitution, lack of forest rights being given to the tribal people, and atrocities being committed against people belonging to scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Let us discuss them one by one. We know that the Constitution of India has created the provisions of the 5th schedule, which provide for alternate or special governance mechanism for certain scheduled areas in the mainland of our country. And in the 5th schedule, various special provisions have been provided for these specified scheduled areas, which among various other things include the constitution of Tribal Advisory Council in the states. And it also provides for some special powers being given to governor with respect to the legislations. Now this provision was created in order to protect the tribals in various states. But what has happened? What has happened is that there is a widespread nepotism in the way tribal advisory councils have been constituted. Although initially it was expected that for formulating any policies with respect to the tribals, the advice of Tribal Advisory Council shall be taken. But what happens is that since the influence of Council of Ministers is so immense that it creates problem at governor and Tribal Advisory Council interface. And more often than not, the Tribal Advisory Council, when it is constituted, it is not a true representative of the tribal population of the state. And apart from that, there is a lack of clarity over the discretionary power of the governor. We know that according to the Constitution of India, the governor is to act on aid and advice of Council of Minister. But according to the provisions of the 5th schedule, governor can act on its own when it comes to the matters related to the scheduled areas. And so this has led to a lot of confusion, and in essence, the true purpose for which the provisions of the 5th schedule were constituted have not been realized. Then comes the matter of forest rights. We know that most of the tribals in our country reside in forested regions. And it is one of the main reasons for the spread of Naxalism as well. Because since the time of the Britishers, we have started to encroach on forested areas. It started with the British government. The monopolization of forests started with the enactment of various forest laws enacted in order to protect the forest. But in the process, we forgot that forest does not just includes the trees and the animals, but also includes people. And since the protection of environment and nature took precedence over the development of the people, there was no Forest Right Acts until 2006, when the Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers Recognition of Forest Rights Act 2006 was legislated. And through this act, the rights of forest dwelling tribal communities and other traditional forest dwellers to forest resources and their rights were recognized for the first time. It was recognized that these communities live on forest, depend on forest, and it is very, very important to give them rights inside their own forests. But if you look at the provisions of FRA 2006, individual right status is decent, but there is minimal community rights, or community rights are not given. There is so much of insistence on evidence. For example, every tribal has to prove through an evidence that they are living in this forest traditionally, and only then their rights will be recognized. And we know that since time immemorial, they have been functioning outside the system which we have created ourselves. And so there is a lack of evidence, which ultimately results in the delay or lack of recognition of the rights provided in Forest Right Act 2006, which ultimately brews the frustration. Then there are atrocities being committed on scheduled caste and scheduled tribal people. We know that there is an act known by the name of Prevention of Atrocities Against SC and ST Act, but it was again legislated in 1989, but by then this problem had already grown. But even if you look at the implementation of this particular act, it lies in the hands of police officials, which again harbor caste prejudices. Ultimately, people sitting in most powerful positions in the bureaucracy and police also have the same caste biases which this particular act tries to fight. And so, the implementation of this particular act, especially in forested regions, has not been great. And then finally, the lack of land reforms. We know that widespread land reforms were carried out after independence, and it has carried on in some states or the other since then. But the land reforms were successful only in few states, for example in Jammu and Kashmir, Kerala and West Bengal. And due to the lack of the political will, most of the steps categorized under land reforms were either not implemented, or if they were implemented, they were not efficient or effective. And so that left the Indian society, especially in these regions, with a lot of landless people. So they don't have their own forests, they don't have land outside the forest, and so it became quite a fertile ground for an extremist ideology like Naxalism. So what is the current status of left-wing extremism and the activities related to it? So if you look at the data from 2001 to 2018, you can see that there is a persistent decline in the left-wing extremism incidents, which means the attacks being carried out by the Naxalites. As compared to more than 2200 incidents in 2010, it has come down to less than 800 cases in 2018, and this is the data given on the Ministry of Home Affairs. And so it clearly shows that there is some traction to the policies and the strategies being followed by the state governments and also the central governments. So all the states affected by LWE have taken their particular measures to suit their local requirements. But in this particular discussion, we are just going to discuss the approach of the central government and the steps taken by them. At the same time, it is important for you to understand that police and public order being the state subject, action with respect to maintenance of law and order lies primarily in the domain of the concerned state governments. Therefore, the policy of the Government of India is to effectively deal with the LWE insurgency primarily by capacity building of the state governments both in areas of security and development. So there is a clear-cut demarcation of the policy. The central government helps various state governments as far as security measures is concerned, and then it also helps the state governments in developing the areas on high priority which are impacted with LWE. So you can see that this is quite a holistic approach. And let us start by first understanding the security measures. First and foremost, outlawing the CPI Maoist, which is the major left-wing extremist organization responsible for most incidents of violence and casualties. And it has been included in the schedule of terrorist organization along with all its formations and front organization under the existing Unlawful Activities Prevention Act 1967 or UAPA. Then, government is taking active measures to strengthen the intelligence mechanism because central government cannot directly police the areas, but it can provide the intelligence inputs to the states. And so in order to counter the growing challenge of LWE activities, several steps have been taken to strengthen and upgrade the capabilities of intelligence agencies both at the center as well as the state level. This includes intelligence sharing through Multi-Agency Center (MAC) at the central level and State Multi-Agency Center at the state level 24/7 basis. These centers enable state and all India level coordination among various agencies involved in countering the LWE. Other steps which have been taken to strengthen the intelligence mechanism include setting up of Joint Command and Control Center at Gaya and at Jagdalpur, which will act as nodal centers to coordinate operation against the CPIM or Naxalites. Then we know that Naxalites take special advantage of the fact that there are limitations in front of the state police, and as soon as you cross the border from one state to another and then from that state to another, you can easily evade the action. And so that is why interstate coordination is a must if you counter LWEs. If you look at the border areas of Chhattisgarh, Odisha and Telangana, which is quite a hotbed for Naxalite activities, this is the main reason. Not only these areas are densely forested, but they also belong to different jurisdictions. And you know that police of one state cannot automatically pursue a criminal in another. And so, taking advantage of this fact, they keep on moving from one state to another. And for this, Ministry of Home Affairs keeps on conducting regular and frequent interstate meetings of not only bureaucrats, police officials, but also the Chief Minister for enabling a better response to LWE. Then we know that majority of casualties to security forces in anti-LWE operations are caused by IEDs or improvised explosive devices. The Ministry of Home Affairs continues to support extensive counter-IED capacity building efforts of state police forces to enable them to timely identify the IEDs and defuse them. And for this purpose, regular training programs are conducted by MHA. Then MHA has created India Reserve or Specialized Indian Reserve Battalion, acronymed as SIRB. The LWE affected states have been sanctioned India Reserve Battalions mainly to strengthen security apparatus at their level and also to enable the states to provide gainful employment to youth, particularly in LWE affected areas. Then there are numerous schemes run by MHA which directly provide advantage to the local police. For example, sanctioning of funds for fortified police stations under the scheme of the same name and carrying out of Civic Action Program or CAP, under which financial grants are provided to CAPFs to undertake various welfare activities in LWE affected areas. And the idea is that CRPF will go to an area, cleanse it from Maoists, keep it free from Maoists, and then develop that area using the same funds. So these are the measures dealing with the security issue. But if we don't develop these areas, these gains will be temporary. And to make these gains permanent, there is a need to develop them as well. And for that also, a lot of schemes are carried out. But in this case, not all schemes are carried out by Ministry of Home Affairs. Now, in the beginning, we discussed how the acts dealing with the conservation of the forest and the nature created the main problem. And so, the Regulation of Forest Conservation Act 1980 have been eased in these areas. And now, it is allowed to divert the forest land for infrastructure creation dealing with the activities mentioned in the schedule. For example, construction of schools, colleges, telecommunication lines, drinking water projects, irrigation projects, creation of roads. For all these activities, the limits up to which a forest land can be diverted has been increased drastically to enable the development of these regions. Then, lack of connectivity is the major tool in the hands of Naxalites. They first disconnect the local population from the mainland and then they carry out their brainwashing. And so connectivity has been a major plank of the government of India. And the connectivity does not means road connectivity only, but it also means communications connectivity. And so the government of India has been implementing road requirement plan and road connectivity project for LWE areas. Also, installation of mobile towers has been on high priority of the government in these regions. Then we talked about how the lack of implementation of the provisions of the Forest Rights Act has created a lot of trouble in these regions. Now government is keeping the timely distribution of the titles or the land titles to the tribals on high priority in LWE areas. According to the recent data by MHA, around 15 lakh titles have been distributed so far, which means that so many people have got the legitimate right to reside inside the forested region. Then we know that various schemes of the government of India, for example, skill development, which is Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana, and many other schemes dealing with the rural development have a special focus on LWE areas. Similarly, Ministry of Education keeps LWE areas on high priority. For example, recently 7 new Kendriya Vidyalayas and 6 new Jawahar Navodaya Vidyalayas have been opened in LWE affected areas. And you'll be surprised to know that out of these, 2 new Kendriya Vidyalayas are to be opened in Gadchiroli and Kondagaon, which are the epicenter of Naxalism. So this is as far as the steps taken by the central government. But there are various unique schemes being run by various state governments. There are some unique surrender policies being run by various state governments, which has led to rapid increase in the surrender by the Naxalites. Similarly, there are some dedicated police force being created to counter LWE. And so let us know in the comment section what can be some important case studies to be cited while writing an answer in the mains examination. So this discussion is very pertinent from the perspective of GS3 mains examination. And this discussion we understood the idea behind Naxalism, how it originated, what were the deficits in our legal framework which actually gave rise to the Naxalism, and then finally what has been the government approach to counter left-wing extremism. Let us now move on to the next news. The next article appears as the lead editorial on page number 6, dealing with India's two-front challenge. In this particular article, the author presents a history as well as the future of India's possibility as far as the attack from China and Pakistan simultaneously is concerned. In this particular article, authors present not just the history but also how India should deal with a situation which is known as two-front war, which basically indicates how India should be prepared to effectively meet simultaneous threats from China on the northern border and Pakistan on the western border. But before that, from the perspective of prelims examination, let us go through some of the important map locations which have been in news in last year. Starting with Depsan Plain, which are very high altitude plain at the northwest portion of the disputed Aksai Chin region of Kashmir, divided into India and Chinese administered portions across the LAC. Now it is important because from here, Chinese have a line of sight extending to Siachen Glacier. Both India and Pakistan claim sovereignty over the entire Siachen Glacier region, as you know. And Depsang Plains and Siachen Glacier are just 88.6 kilometers apart. Then the next important location is Galwan Valley, Hot Spring region, Pangong So Lake, Shyok River, Pangong So Lake and its 8 fingers. These are nothing but the spurs ending into Pangong So Lake. and so there are 8 spurs or 8 fingers, as you can see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 and 8. And this is the site of confrontation, as India and China have different understanding of where the line of actual control passes through. India has maintained that LAC passes through finger 8, but China on the other hand says that LAC passes through finger 2, and it has been patrolling up to finger 4 region, mostly in light vehicles. The confrontation that took place in May happened at finger 5 area. And so these are the important map locations, and now let us move on to the contention made in today's editorial. So authors start the article by saying that any mention of two-front war evoked two kinds of contrasting opinions in India. On one side, we have an opinion of military, and on the other side, we have an opinion of political class. So as far as the view of the Indian military is concerned, it has always believed that a partnership between China and Pakistan and their joint attack is quite a real possibility, and we must develop capabilities to counter this challenge. So this is the view of Indian military. But on the other hand, political class has always thought otherwise. The political class in general, until very recently, has believed that a two-front threat is not a real possibility, is rather a hype created out of the friendship of China and Pakistan. They have argued that China has never intervened militarily in any of the India and Pakistan conflicts in the past. And since India has deep-rooted economic and diplomatic ties with China, which actually defend and rule out any armed conflict between the two countries simultaneously when India is going through a war with Pakistan. So these have been the two conflicting opinions. And since we know that in India, the military follows what political class believes, and hence as a result, India has always focused on Pakistan and the threats arising out from Pakistan. However, whenever India has forgotten that it has two enemies or antagonists from two sides, or it has let its guard down, it has paid heavily for it. Let's take the example of 1962 war. Indian government in 1962 believed that there is no threat from China, and the principal enemy or the principal threat was from Pakistan. But what happened in 1962? We know how Chinese troops advanced over Indian forces in Ladakh as well as across the McMahon line, and India was defeated decisively in that battle. On the other hand, whenever India has believed that two-front war is a real possibility and it has accounted for such a prospect, it has done well. And the best example is 1971 war. In 1971, we know and the role we played in the bifurcation of Pakistan. But at the same time, when we were fighting the war with Pakistan, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi understood the threats from China, and in order to deter China from attacking India at the same time when India was fighting war with Pakistan, she finalized Treaty of Peace, Friendship and Cooperation with the USSR. Of course, it was a significant deviation from India's previous position of non-alignment during Cold War, but the treaty was mainly targeted and caused by increasing Pakistani ties with China. So you can see that whenever India has discounted likelihood of a two-front war, it has gone against India, but whenever the central government has taken into account such a possibility, it has done well. But according to the authors, this has now changed because of the recent intrusions by China in May in various locations in Ladakh, and especially the violence that resulted from clashes between Indian Army and People's Liberation Army. These incidents have tilted the opinion of the political leaders. And now, Chinese military threat is more apparent and real. And because of this, and as a direct consequence of this, the two-front war situation has been actively being discussed at the central level. Now, according to the authors, even if the current India-China crisis on the border is resolved peacefully, China's military challenge will occupy greater attention of Indian military planners in the months and years to come. Now, why two-front war situation is being actively discussed is because the ceasefire violations along line of control has significantly increased in past 2 to 3 years, and at the same time, China is intruding into areas so far believed to be Indian territories. Also, there are reports that have indicated that Pakistan has moved 20,000 troops into Gilgit-Baltistan, which actually match the Chinese deployment in eastern Ladakh. So, what are the threats which emanate from China and Pakistan military links? So, if you want to understand the friendship of China and Pakistan in military sense, we know that China has always looked at Pakistan as counter to India's influence in South Asia. If you want to put down India, promote Pakistan. So that has always been a mainstay of philosophy of China's and Pakistan friendship. Not just that, over the years, the ties between the two countries have solidified and strengthened to a great extent. An indication of increasing military cooperation is the fact that China accounts for 73% of the total arms import of Pakistan between the period of last 4 years. Not just that, the two countries have recently concluded Shaheen 9, which was a Pakistan-China joint Air Force exercise. And strategic thinkers believe that it was meant to be a kind of preparation for a likelihood of a two-front war with India. And so, it would be prudent for India to be ready for a two-front threat. In preparing for this, the Indian military needs to realistically analyze how this threat could manifest itself and the type of capabilities that should be built up to counter it. So what needs to be done in a likely scenario of a two-front war? So of course, a straightforward answer would be to strengthen our military capabilities. According to strategic and military thinkers, around 60 combat squadrons are needed to deal with a serious two-front threat, which means an attack from China and Pakistan would require India to have at least 60 squadrons of Air Force. But the problem is this is double the number of squadrons currently with the Indian Air Force. And so obviously it is neither practical nor feasible to build a level of capability that enables independent war fighting on both the fronts. And so authors suggest some other ways to counter a likely two-front scenario. First is of course development of a doctrine with a close interaction with political leadership. Because any doctrine that is prepared without a political aim will not stand the test when it is actually to be executed. The second is the development of capabilities, which requires a serious debate because we have just understood that in order to meet a real challenge simultaneously from China and Pakistan would require a significant increase in the defense budget as there is too much focus on traditional warfare. For example, when we talk about meeting the two-front war scenario, we always think of acquiring aircraft, ships, tanks. And according to the author, the focus now needs to shift from these traditional warfare methods to the upcoming and emerging technologies such as robotics, artificial intelligence, cyber, electronic warfare. And according to the author, the right balance will have to be struck based on a detailed assessment of China-Pakistan's war-fighting strategies. Then the role played by diplomacy cannot be ignored because we have seen how diplomacy, especially by regional dominant players, can stop an upcoming war. For example, we all saw how Russia negotiated a deal between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And so to begin with, New Delhi would do well to improve relation with its neighbors so as not to be caught in an unfriendly neighborhood given how Beijing and Islamabad will attempt to contain and constrain India in the region. And this has not been going well, especially if we consider our relation with Nepal and Bangladesh. The ties have been deteriorating. Then author lauds the Indian government's approach to cement the ties with the powers in West Asia. But the lacking area is the relation with Iran, which should be strengthened in order to ensure energy security. Then in the scenario of closing relationship between India and US, India should never forget its ties with Moscow, which could play a key role in diffusing the severity of regional gang up against India, as we have seen was done by USSR in 1971. And then according to the author, the emphasis on Quad is not quite well planned because after all Quad is a maritime group and India has a continental problem far away from the oceans. So if you want to counter China in South China Sea, that is a good strategy. But if you want to counter China and Pakistan in and around regions of Jammu, Kashmir and Ladakh, we cannot rely on Quad. And then finally, we need to have a solid outreach to Kashmir and its people. Because in a likelihood of a two-front war with Pakistan and China, if the people of Kashmir are not approached timely, then that would be another problem to be sorted at the same time. and also from a long view perspective, political outreach to Kashmir aimed at pacifying the aggrieved citizens there would go a long way towards that end. So this was quite a holistic article, not only explaining what two-front war challenge is, but how India should be approaching this particular scenario. Let's now move on to the next article. Now this next article which we are going to take up appears on page number 11. China defends progress of Pak corridor. It rejects reports of seeking additional guarantees from Islamabad before sanctioning a loan for CPEC. Now Belt and Road Initiative has been discussed multiple times in our DNS. And so the basics of Belt and Road Initiative will not be discussed. But what shall be discussed today will be the issues in the implementation of much talked about and hyped project of China, which is Belt and Road Initiative, or which was earlier known as One Belt and One Road, or OBOR, which is a global infrastructure development strategy adopted by Chinese government in 2013. And since it has already been more than 5 to 6 years, the problems have come to the fore. And from the perspective of GS Paper 2, International Relations, it is important for us to understand what troubles it has faced and what challenges it has created across the world. We know that China has sunk hundreds of billions of dollars into infrastructural projects across the world, be it ports, railways, energy projects across Asia, Africa, and Europe. And now what it seems to be is that the goal was just not to expand the infrastructure, but to also win over local population and governments by funneling investments, jobs, economic growth in their direction. But it is easier said than done. Although Chinese have sold their idea of Belt and Road Initiative as a win-win cooperation, but there are significant chinks in the armor. Question over the implementation of BRI are among several which are facing the country regarding the limits of its power, especially in the context of rising protest in Hong Kong and its escalating trade war with United States. So let us now understand the issues in the implementation of BRI. And you must have read the news regarding escalating debt problems in countries where the BRI projects have been taken up. The $62 billion CPEC, or China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, has already been scaled back amid Pakistan's increasing debt problems. Similarly, in Myanmar also, the deal was cut down from $7 billion to $1.3 billion, simply because these countries cannot afford to pay the interest on these much loans. Similarly, the recent case in Sri Lanka is noteworthy, which garnered global headlines after the government could not repay its loans and granted a state-owned Chinese company a 99-year lease on the port as a form of debt relief. So basically, Sri Lanka took the loan, could not repay the loan, and instead gave the full port for 99 years to China. This has actually scared other countries which are in line to take the loan. Similarly, a lot of countries and the opposition parties in these countries have alleged massive corruption on behalf of the Chinese, where the incidents have been reported that Chinese officials have bribed the government in order to agree and accept the terms and conditions of BRI projects. Similarly, Maldives is seeking debt forgiveness following corruption allegations connected to BRI. And these scandals have come in the backdrop of slowing Chinese economy, which would then mean that the kind of cash which was put by Chinese 5 years ago would not be possible in the future. And so a lot of countries have started to believe that the implementation of many of these projects has been too hasty and sufficient consideration for long-term economic benefits have not been done, especially with the local population and local government in consideration. Apart from these, on many occasions, the projects have relied too much on the support of the government and policies. And so as soon as the local government changes, the approach towards BRI also changes. Apart from that, many African nations have alleged that implementing agencies put too much emphasis on the benefits of the BRI for China itself, without considering the concerns of local governments, communities and companies. And then finally, One of the major challenges which China is going to face is that most countries are positive about BRI, but they are not willing to make their own contribution because they take it for granted that China should pay for most of the cost since it is very enthusiastic in promoting the BRI and must benefit enormously from it. So why to invest a single penny in that? And so all of this has created a suspicion, resistance, and even public criticism in international community toward BRI, including those countries along One Belt, One Road and some other regional powers as well. So these criticisms of BRI or Belt and Road initiatives are very, very important. They go on to show that how a much hyped project of China to increase its hegemony and influence, especially in Africa and Asia, is facing a backlash across this region. Let's now move on to the next article. This last article which we are going to discuss appears on page number 7. Granting bail is the rule. The refusal to grant bail deprives individuals of liberty by confining them in jails without trial and conviction. So in this regard, we will go through the discussion which will not only make you aware with the basic terms, but will also put across the main argument raised by the authors. So according to the author, what should be the ideal scenario? The ideal scenario is that bail is the rule, jail is the exception, which has already been laid down by the Supreme Court of India in landmark judgment of State of Rajasthan versus Bal Chand Balia. Also recently, Supreme Court, while granting bail to an accused, emphasized that granting or rejecting bail should not be a mechanical manner because it is a matter directly connected with the liberty of a person. And this legal doctrine was given by one of the most renowned Justice V. Krishna Iyer, who based it on fundamental rights guaranteed by the Constitution of India. Because the refusal to grant bail deprives individuals of liberty by confining them in jail without trial and conviction. So this is the ideal scenario, but what is the usual practice? According to the authors and the data presented by them, the practice is that jail becomes the rule and bail becomes an exception. Because at present, the power to grant bail is exercised sparingly by lower courts. And this results in several problems. For example, it compounds problems for the accused as they are required to approach High Court or Supreme Court against the lower court orders, because the denial of bail would obviously mean that the accused person will go to a higher judiciary. This results in delay in the case and forces the accused to remain incarcerated as under trials for extended periods of time. It not only increases the backlog in judicial system, but it creates overcrowded jails. Not just that, it has a social bias also. Because according to the data presented by the authors, 2/3 of India's prison population presently comprises under trials from Dalit, Adivasi and OBC communities, which are often accused of minor offences. So on one hand, you have people from upper caste or upper echelons of power who are given bail even in serious matters of murders, but people belonging to the vulnerable sections are put for years in jail on minor offences like chain snatching and pickpocketing. And pandemic has added a layer of complexity, because the pendency of bail application has increased during pandemic because the courts were shut down for a long period of time, and in this while the lockdown was implemented, there has been an increasing number of arrests even for minor offences by various state police. And the problem is that despite many judgments and orders by Supreme Courts to decongest prisons, arrests for minor offences has continued unabated, and this has been demonstrated by a study conducted in Madhya Pradesh. So in this regard, let us understand how does the bail mechanism works. So bail commonly means release on one's own bond with or without sureties. So a surety is a person who comes to the court and promises to a judge or a justice of peace to supervise an accused person while they are out on bail. So a surety also pledges or promises an amount of money to the court by signing bail bond. And so the effect of granting bail is not to set the accused free, but to release him from custody and to entrust him to his own bond and to the custody of his sureties, who are bound to produce him to appear at his trial at a specified time and place in the court. Thus, bail is a security obtained from a person arrested regarding an offence for the purpose of securing his presence during the course of trial. And so in this regard, let us understand some important terms, and these are non-bailable offense, cognizable offense and non-cognizable offense. So when a person is accused of non-bailable offense, then in such a case, bail can only be granted by a court and not by an officer. Application for bail has to be made in court in such cases of non-bailable offense. Whereas cognizable offenses means an offense for which a police officer may arrest without warrant in accordance with the first schedule of CRPC or under any other law. Non-cognizable offense, on the other hand, means an offense for which a police officer has no authority to arrest without warrant. And so in this regard, let us understand the problem of the vulnerable section. It becomes difficult to acquire money for bail bond by marginalized sections, because the system of bail typically requires sureties to furnish a bond for some property valued at the amount determined by the concerned judge. And in most of the offences, it is never less than 10,000 rupees, especially in the matters dealing with the subordinate courts. For example, a 14-year-old minor's surety for 4 cases of theft and housebreaking was set at rupees 2 lakh by Sessions Court in Bhopal. And so without monetary assets, it becomes difficult for a sizable population to arrange the bail amount for release. And therefore, those without assets, even when granted bail, end up languishing in jails or incur heavy debt which they have to repay back to ensure their freedom. Further, grant of bail on personal bond without sureties, that is, release on one's own guarantee without any monetary amounts, although permissible in law, is very, very rare. So in this regard, Center for Law and Policy Research has recommended the creation of checklists to address individual discretion while deciding bail applications. But even after that checklist, the judicial decisions are also going to reflect our society's inherent caste and class biases, because ultimately they are derived from the same society.